All right. We are on section 8 of the Antinomy. I've been saying antimony a lot. It's kind of embarrassing, but nobody's watching this, so it's fine. So, Antinomy of Pure Reason, section 8, the regulative principle of pure reason with regard to cosmological ideas. As through the cosmological principle of totality, no real maximum of the series of conditions in the world of sense considered as such a thing in itself is given. Yes, meaning the totality of experience as a thing in itself, like as it is objectively, is given, but can only be given as a task in the regress of the series, this principle of pure reason. Right, potentially we could just like trace stuff back as a task, like as a, this caused this, etc. And try to piece together the totality or whatever, but it's not given. If thus amended, still retains its validity. And it retains its validity. Needs to go post it as a bookmark. Okay. Stuck to the page. Sorry. And it retains its validity, indeed as an axiom, for thinking the totality in the object as real, but as a problem for the understanding. And therefore for the subject, encouraging us to undertake and continue, according to the completeness in the idea, the regress in the series of conditions of a given conditioned. Right, so we want to do it, and in our heads we kind of do it probably automatically a little bit, to some extent. In our sensibility, that is, in space and time, every condition which we can reach in examining given appearances is again conditioned. Because these appearances are not objects in themselves, right? In which something absolutely unconditioned might possibly exist. Rather, they are merely empirical representations, which must always have their condition, whereby they are determined with regard to space and time, in intuition. Right. This is like transcendental aesthetic stuff. Makes sense. The principle of reason is therefore, properly speaking, only a rule, which, in the series of conditions of given appearances, prescribes to us a great regress that is never allowed to stop at anything absolutely unconditioned. Right, because we're experiencing the world as appearances, and we don't know things in themselves. Even if we do regress to something, it's not going to suddenly transform from a conditioned appearance into the thing in itself. That doesn't really make sense. It is therefore not a principle of the possibility of experience and of the empirical knowledge of the objects of the senses, and hence is not a principle of the understanding. For every experience is, according to a given intuition, enclosed within its limits. Nor is it a constitutive principle of reason, enabling us to extend the concept of the world of sense beyond all possible experience. My understanding is like Kant talks about like regulative things that are like how would I describe? I guess constitutive, like how the world is composed, and regulative is like how we like interact with the world. If that makes sense. I don't know. Let's see what he says. It is rather a principle of the greatest possible continuation and extension of our experience. allowing no empirical limit to be taken as an absolute limit. It is therefore a principle of reason, which as a rule postulates what we ought to do in the regress, but does not anticipate what may be given in the object prior to such a regress. So it tells us how to do the regress. Reason tells us how to do the regress, but it doesn't necessarily tell us, it can't necessarily tell us what's actually in the regress. Or it doesn't result in us experiencing things in themselves in a regress. Might be a better way to put it. I therefore call it a regulative principle of reason, while in contrast, the principle of absolute totality of the series of conditions, as given in the object, the appearances in itself, would be a constitutive cosmological principle. Right, so the regulative is like how we do something, and the constitutive is like what it actually is, the answer, I think. The hollowness of such a constitutive principle I have tried to indicate by this very distinction, and so have tried to prevent what otherwise would have inevitably happened through a transcendental subreption, namely our ascribing objective reality to an idea which serves merely as a rule. Right. Saying that the regress, our mistake would be saying that the regress is objective reality as opposed to just a way to potentially trace things back to a possible answer, but probably not an answer. In order properly to define the meaning of this rule of pure reason, it should be remarked, first of all, that it cannot tell us what the object is, but only how the empirical regress is to be carried out, in order for us to arrive at the complete concept of the object. If we attempted the first, to try to find out what the object is, it would become a constitutive principle, such as pure reason can never supply. Right? We need intuitions to tell us, yeah, but even then it's just appearances, it's not things in themselves. But it cannot therefore be our intention to say through this principle that a series of conditions of a given conditioned is in itself either finite or infinite. For in that case, a mere idea of absolute totality produced only in that idea itself, would think an object such as cannot be given in any experience. That makes sense. And it would do so by attributing an objective reality independent of empirical synthesis to a series of appearances. The idea of reason will therefore do no more than prescribe a rule to the regressive synthesis in the series of conditions. According to this rule, the synthesis is to advance from the conditioned through all subordinate conditions toward the unconditioned. Yet it can never reach the unconditioned. For the absolutely unconditioned can never be met in experience. It's like the nature of our experience. It's the whole transcendental aesthetic, things as appearances. Okay, it starts to freak me out when I'm kind of getting Kant and not confused. To this end, it is necessary, first of all, to define accurately the synthesis of a series, insofar as it is never complete. People are in the habit of using for this purpose two expressions which are meant to establish a distinction, though they are unable clearly to indicate the ground of the distinction. Mathematicians speak only of a progressus in infinitum. Those who inquire into concepts, philosophers, by contrast, will only admit the expression of a progressus in Indefinitum. Without wasting any time in the examination of the reasons which may have suggested such a distinction, and of its useful or useless application, I shall at once endeavor to define these concepts accurately for my own purpose. Okay, good idea. Of a straight line, it can only be correctly said that it may be produced to infinity. And here the distinction between an infinite and an indeterminately long progress would be a mere subtlety. Okay, I think I know what he's saying. Or I think I know what he's going to say. No doubt, if we are told to continue drawing a line, it would be more correct to add in definitum than to add in infinitum. Right, do it for as long as you can, not forever. For the former means indefinitum no more than produce as far as you wish, but the second, you shall never cease producing it. See, we got there, chat. Which is not what is intended. Nevertheless, if we speak only of what can be done, then the former expression is quite correct. Right, what we can draw. Because we can always make it longer without end. The same applies in all cases where we speak only of the progressus, that is, of our progress from the condition to the conditioned. For in the series of appearances, such a possible progress proceeds to infinity. From a given pair of parents, we may, in the descending line of generation, proceed without end, and readily think that this line could so continue in the world. For here reason never requires an absolute totality of the series, because it is not presupposed as a condition, and as given, but only as something conditioned, that is only capable of being given, and is added to without end. Right, you just keep going and going and going. It doesn't necessarily go on forever, if that makes sense. The case is totally different with the problem of how far the regress from something given as condition can ascend in a series of conditions. Can I call it a regress in infinitum, or only a regress that is extended indeterminably far, in indefinitum? Can I therefore ascend from the human beings now living through the series of their ancestors in infinitum? Or can I only say that as far back as I have gone, I never met with an empirical ground for considering the series limited anywhere, so that I feel justified, and at the same time obliged, to search, in the case of an ancestor, also for his ancestors, though not indeed to presuppose them. Right. Okay. I answer, therefore, that if the whole is given in empirical intuition, then the regress in the series of its inner conditions proceeds in infinitum. Okay, would this be something like if the whole is given? Kant has already said like the whole is never given, I think, but would the idea be like, okay, let's say the hypothesis is the universe extends like infinitely right now, like it never stops. That could be extended in infinitum, like infinitely, currently, whereas like something that goes back in time it potentially has to stop somewhere. While it could continue forever, since you're not given the whole series at once, it is a regression as opposed to like a potential infinite. I'm not sure. I answer therefore that if the whole is given in empirical intuition, then the regress in the series of its inner conditions proceeds in infinitum. But if only a member of the series is given, and the regress from this member to the absolute totality has first of all to be carried out, then the regress is only of indeterminate distance, in indefinitum. Okay, so like if you're given like the whole of a thing, and you don't have to do a regress, and it potentially is infinite, that would be in infinitum. But if you're given, Ferd, and like, trace Ferd's lineage back to whoever, and it goes on infinitely, having to do the regression effectively means it's not the same. It's indefinitum. It's something that can be traced back as far as you want to, but okay. Thus we may say that the division of matter given between its limits, a body, proceeds in infinitum. Okay. So the division, like dividing a piece of matter that's like sitting on your desk, that can be divisible infinitely, like smaller and smaller parts, let's say. That would be an infinitum. For this matter is given as a whole, and therefore with all its possible parts, in empirical intuition. Since the condition of this whole is its part, and the condition of this part is part of the part, and so on, and as in this regress of deep composition, we never meet with an unconditioned, indivisible member of that series of conditions, not only is there nowhere an empirical ground for stopping the division, but the further members of this continued division are themselves empirically given prior to the continuation of the division. That is, the division goes on in infinitum. Effectively, all the divisions are given at once. You just have to do them. But you don't have to do the regression, I guess. On the contrary, this so one has like kind of a temporal element, and the other has kind of a how you say non-temporal element to it. On the contrary, the series of ancestors of any given human being is not given in its absolute totality in any possible experience, while the regress still goes on from every member in this generation to a higher one, so that no empirical limit can be found, which should present a member as absolutely unconditioned. Since, however, the members which might supply the condition are not contained in the empirical intuition of the whole prior to the regress does not proceed in infinitum by a division of what is given, but to an indefinite distance in its search for more members in addition to those which are given, and these further members are themselves again always given only as conditioned. In either case, the regress in infinitum or the regress in indefinitum is the series of conditions considered as given as infinite in the object. The conditions are not things that are given in themselves, but only as appearances. Okay. The conditions are not things that are given in themselves, but only appearances, which as conditions of one another are given only in the regress itself. Okay, we know that. Therefore, the question is no longer how great this series of conditions may be in itself, whether finite or infinite, for it is nothing in itself, but only how we are to carry out the empirical regress and how far we may continue it. And here we see a very important difference with regard to the rule of this progress. If the whole is given empirically, it is possible to go back in the series of conditions in infinitum. Right, but it's not really... Okay. But if the whole is not given, but has first to be given through an empirical regress, I can only say that it is possible in infinitum to proceed still higher conditions of the series. In the former case, I could say that more members exist and are empirically given than I can reach through the regress of decomposition. In the latter, I can only say that I may advance still further in the regress, but no member is empirically given as absolutely unconditioned. And since a higher member is therefore always possible, the inquiry concerning it is necessary. So the inquiry is necessary. Okay. Further inquiry, I guess. In the former case, it was necessary to find more members of the series. In the latter, it is necessary always to inquire for more, because no experience is absolutely limiting. For either you have no perception which absolutely limits your empirical regress, and in that case you cannot consider this regress as completed, or you have a perception which limits your series, and in that case you cannot be a part of the series traversed, because what limits must be distinct from what is limited by it, and you must therefore continue your regress still further to this condition also, and so on. The following section, by showing their application, will place these observations in their proper light. I sure hope so. Okay, so we're on to section 9 of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to all cosmological ideas. No transcendental use, as we have shown on several occasions, can be made of the concepts. No transcendental use, as we have shown on several occasions, can be made of the concepts, either of the understanding or of reason. Okay, and the can be made of the concepts, either of the understanding or of reason, and the absolute totality of the series of conditions in the world of sense is due entirely to a transcendental use of reason, which demands this unconditioned completeness, what it presupposes as a thing in itself. I gotta read that again. And the absolute totality of the series of conditions in the world of sense is due entirely to a transcendental use of reason, which demands this unconditioned completeness from what it presupposes as a thing in itself. Okay. As no such completeness is contained in the world of sense, we can never speak again of the absolute magnitude of different series occurring in it, whether they be limited or in themselves unlimited. Rather, the question can only be how far, in the empirical regress, may we go back in tracing experience to its conditions, in order that we may stop, according to the rule of reason, at no other answer to its questions, but such as in conformity with the object. What therefore remains to us is only the validity of the principle of reason as a rule for the continuation and magnitude of a possible experience. After its invalidity as a constitutive principle of appearances, considered as things in themselves, has been sufficiently established. If we have clearly... Okay, so he's just talking about things in themselves, not knowing them, appearances, what we can and can't do related to the regress, what's valid and not valid. Okay. I'm probably missing a lot of stuff, but I'm just kind of trying to ground myself. If we have clearly established that in that invalidity, the conflict of reason with itself will be entirely finished. For not only has the illusion which led to that conflict been removed through this critical analysis, but in its place we are clearly exhibiting the sense in which reason agrees with itself, and the misinterpretation of which was the sole cause of the conflict, and are converting a principle which otherwise would be only dialectical into a doctrinal one. Okay, what he's saying is, like, once we consider them as just appearances, the whole kind of experiment falls apart, and we see that it's dialectical, not doctrinal type of thing. You know, that. In fact, if this principle, according to its subjective meaning, can be proved fit to determine the greatest possible use of the understanding in experience in conformity with the objects of experience, then this would be the same as if we determined, like an axiom, the objects in themselves a priori, which is impossible from pure reason. For this, too, could, with reference to the objects of experience, exercise no greater influence in the expansion and correction of our knowledge than would prove itself efficient in the most extensive empirical use of our understanding. Okay, section 1, or part 1 of section 9 of the Antinomy: solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the composition of appearances of a cosmic whole. So a solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the composition of appearances of a cosmic whole. Fake title, not not real. Okay, here, as well as in other cosmological questions, the regulative principle of reason is founded on the proposition that in the empirical regress we can meet with no experience of an absolute limit, that is, no experience of any conditioned as one that empirically is absolutely unconditioned. Okay, we can't empirically meet with something that's absolutely unconditioned. Okay, makes sense. Another way to say that is probably like, can never meet with things in themselves, right? The ground of this is that such an experience would contain a limitation of appearances by nothing, or by the void, which the continued regress must encounter by means of perception, and this is impossible. This proposition, which says that in an empirical regress, I can only arrive at a condition which itself must be considered empirically conditioned, contains the rule in terminus, that however far I may have advanced in the ascending series, I must always inquire for a still higher member of that series, whether it be known to me through experience or not. Okay. For the solution to the first cosmological problem, therefore, nothing more is wanted than to determine whether in the regress... Okay, so we're coming back to the problems. In the regress to the unconditioned magnitude of the cosmic whole in time and space, this nowhere limited ascent can be called a regress to infinity, or only indeterminately continued regress. Okay, is he saying we have to figure out if it's in infinitum or indefinitum time? For the solution for the first cosmological problem, therefore, nothing more is wanted than to determine whether in the regress of the unconditioned... Okay, so first cosmological problem. In the regress to the unconditioned magnitude of the cosmic whole in time and space, this nowhere limited ascent can be called a regress to infinity, or only indeterminately continued regress. Okay. So yes, that's what we have to figure out. The merely general representation of the series of all past states of the world, as well as of all the things which exist at the same time in cosmic space, is itself nothing but a possible empirical regress, which I think to myself, though as yet indeterminately, of all past states of the world, as well as all of the things which exist at the same time in cosmic space, is itself nothing but a possible empirical regress, which I think to myself, though as yet undeterminately. And through this possible regress alone can the concept of such a series of conditions of a given perception arise. Okay, and through this possible regress alone can the concept of such a series of conditions of a given perception arise. Now the cosmic whole exists for me only in concept, and never as a whole in intuition. Hence I cannot from this magnitude infer the magnitude of the regress, and determine the one by the other. Rather, I must first frame for myself a concept of the magnitude of the world through the magnitude of the empirical regress. Okay. Of this, however, I never know anything more that I must go on empirically from every given member of the series of conditions to a higher and more distant member. Sounds like indefinitum to me, but no, wait, that's gonna be wrong. Hence, the magnitude of the whole of appearances, is not thereby absolutely determined. And we also cannot say, therefore, that it is a regress in infinitum. We cannot say that. Okay, I saw in infinitum in the next sentence. It was like, I must be wrong, I guess. Because this would anticipate the members which the regress has not yet reached, and represent its multitude as so large that no empirical synthesis could ever reach it. It would therefore determine only through, though only negatively, the magnitude of the world prior to the regress. Okay, which is impossible, of course. For this world is not given to me by any intuition in its totality, and so its magnitude cannot be given prior to the regress either. Hence we cannot say anything of the magnitude of the world in itself. Not even that there is in it a regress in infinitum, But we must merely look for the concept of its magnitude, according to the rule that determines the empirical regress in it. We must merely look for the concept of its magnitude, according to the rule that determines the empirical regress in it. This rule, however, says no more than that however far we may have got to the series of empirical conditions, we ought never to assume an absolute limit, but subordinate every appearance as conditioned to another as its conditioned, and that a condition, and that hence we must proceed further to this condition. This is the regress in indefinitum. Haha! I had a 50-50 shot. Which, as it determines no magnitude of the object, can clearly enough be distinguished from the regress in infinitum. Okay. Well, that's good. Therefore, I cannot say that as regards to past time, or as regards to space, the world is infinite. Why not? For such a concept of magnitude as a given infinity is empirical, and therefore is, with respect to the world taken as an object of the senses, absolutely impossible. Yes? Nor shall I say that the regress, beginning with a given perception, and going on to everything that limits in a series, both in space and in past time, proceeds in infinitum, because saying this would presuppose an infinite magnitude of the world. Okay. Nor can I say that the regress is finite. It's just my highlight. This text is just a block of yellow. Just highlight everything. Nor can I say this regress is finite, for the absolute limit is likewise empirically impossible. I just need to reread the whole book. Nor can I say that this regress is finite, for the absolute limit is likewise empirically impossible. Hence it follows that I shall not be able to say anything of the whole object of experience, the world of sense, but only of the rule according to which experience can take place and be continued in conformity with its object. To the cosmological question, therefore, concerning the magnitude of the world, the first and negative answer is that the world has no first beginning in time and no outermost limit in space. For in the contrary case, the world would be limited by empty time on the one hand, and by empty space on the other. Since, however, as an appearance, the world cannot in itself be limited in either way, because appearance is not a thing in itself, we should have to admit the perception of a limitation by absolutely empty time or space, though which these ends of the world could be given in a possible experience. Through which these ends of the world could be given in possible experience. Such an experience, however, would be perfectly void of content, and therefore impossible. Okay. Consequently, an absolute limit of the world is impossible empirically, and therefore also absolutely. From this follows the same time the affirmative answer that the regress in the series of appearances of the world, intended as a determination of the magnitude of the world, goes on. So from this it follows that the affirmative answer that the regress in the series of the appearances of the world, intended as a determination of the magnitude of the world, goes on in indefinitum. which is the same as if we say the world of sense has no absolute magnitude, but that the empirical regress, through which alone it can be given on the side of its conditions, has its own rule, namely that we are to advance from every member of the series, as conditioned, to a more distant member, whether by our own experience or by guidance of history, or through the chain of causes and their effects, and are never to dispense with the expansion of the possible empirical use of the understanding, this expansion being the proper and only task of reason and its principles. This rule does not prescribe a determinate empirical regress that advances without end in a certain kind of appearances, as for instance, that from a living person one ought always to ascend in a series of ancestors without ever expecting a first pair. Or, doesn't somebody... Am I the only one that's like, yeah, there's first pair? I don't know, somewhere. That's a definite line that you can just... I don't know. At some point they were, I don't know. They transformed from monkeys into people or something. Anyway, as for instance, that from a living person one ought always to ascend in a series of ancestors without ever expecting a first pair, or in a series of cosmic bodies, one ought always to ascend without admitting, in the end, an outermost sun. I agree with that one. All that is demanded by the rule is a progress from appearances to appearances, even if they should not furnish us with any actual perception. If it is too weak in degree to become experience in our consciousness, because even thus these appearances belong to possible experience. Every beginning is in time, and every limit of what is extended is in space. Space and time, however, are only in the world of sense, and therefore they're not appearances, right? Hence, only appearances in the world are limited conditionally. The world itself, however, is limited neither conditionally or unconditionally. Okay. The appearances issue. For the same reason, and because the world can never be given completely. Okay, because it's an appearance and because it can't be given completely. I'm paraphrasing, but... And even the series of conditions of a given conditioned cannot, as a series of the world, be given completely. The concept of the magnitude of the world can be given only through the regress, and not prior to it in any collective intuition. This regress, however, consists only in the determining of the magnitude. It does not give, therefore, any determinate concept. Okay. Nor the concept of a magnitude, which, with regard to a certain measure, would be infinite. It does not therefore proceed to the infinite, as though the infinite were given, but only to an indeterminate distance, in order to give a magnitude of experience, which first becomes actual through this very regress. Okay? Alright, part 2. Solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the division of the whole given in intuition. Okay. It's called the solution. If I divide a whole, which is given in intuition, I proceed from something conditioned to the conditions of its possibility. The division of its parts, subdivisio or decompositio, is a regress. The division is a regress in the series of these conditions. Okay. The absolute totality of this series would only be given if the regress could reach the simple parts. But if all parts in a continuously progressing decomposition are always divisible again, then the division, that is, the regress from the conditioned to to its conditions goes on in infinitum. Yeah, we talked about this example. For the conditions, the parts are contained in the conditions itself, right? You don't have to like do a regress to ancestors or, parts of the causal chain. It's just a thing and you're trying to divide it, and you can do that potentially infinitely. And you're given everything right there. And as the conditioned is given as complete, in an intuition enclosed within limits, the conditions are also given with it. Fair, okay. That's kind of an interesting note that I hadn't really thought of. The regress must therefore not be called a regress in indefinitum, such as we were allowed to call the former cosmological idea alone. For where from the conditioned we had to proceed to conditions given outside it. Given outside of it, and therefore not given at the same time through it, but first to be added in the empirical regress. Okay. We are not allowed to say, however, even in the case of a whole that is divisible in infinitum, that it consists... Okay, we are not able to say that it consists of infinitely many parts. For although all parts are contained in the intuition of the whole, yet the whole division is not contained in it, because it consists in the continuous decomposition, or in the regress itself, which makes the first series actual. As this regress is infinite, all parts, at which it arrives, are contained, no doubt, in the given whole, regarded as an aggregate, but not so contained is the whole series of the division, which is successively infinite and never whole, and cannot therefore exhibit an infinite multitude or any collection of such a multitude in a whole. Okay. It is easy to apply this general remark to space. Every space intuited within its limits is a whole, the parts of which, in spite of all decomposition, are always spaces again, and therefore divisible in infinitum. Okay. From this follows quite naturally the second application to an outer appearance enclosed within its limits, body. The divisibility of this is founded on the divisibility of space, for space constitutes the possibility of the body as an extended whole. This body, therefore, divisible in infinitum, without consisting, however, this body is, therefore, divisible in infinitum, without consisting, however, of an infinite number of parts. Okay. It might indeed seem, since a body must be represented as a substance in space, that it will differ from space with regard to the law of the divisibility of space. For we may concede that in the latter case, decomposition could never remove all composition in space, because in that case all space, which otherwise has nothing to it that is independent, would cease to be, which is impossible. What? For we may concede that in the latter case, decomposition could never remove all composition in space, because in that case, all space, which otherwise has nothing to it that is independent, meaning you can only break it down so far, like even a thing in space so far, but it still takes up a space, so like... But you can't break that down unless you like disappear the space. Is that kind of what he's getting at? I don't know, this is weird. On the contrary, the assertion that if all composition of matter were removed in thought, then nothing should remain of it. If all composition of matter were removed in thought, then nothing should remain of it, does not seem compatible with the concept of substance. For a substance is meant to be the subject of all composition, and ought to remain in its elements, even though their connection in space, by which they become a body, be removed. But what applies to a thing in itself, thought through a pure concept of the understanding, does not apply to what in appearance is called substance. This substance is not an absolute subject, but only a permanent image of sensibility, and is in fact nothing but intuition. Right, it's only an appearance. Okay. In which nothing unconditioned can ever be met with. But although this rule of the progress in infinitum applies without any doubt to the subdivision of an appearance as a mere occupant of space, it does not apply to the multitude of the parts which are already separated in a way in a given whole, so as to constitute a quantum discretum. Discretum? But although this rule of the progress in infinitum applies without any doubt to the subdivision of an appearance, meaning it applies to appearances, as a mere occupant of space, it does not apply to the multitude of the parts which are already separated in a certain way in a given whole, so as to constitute a quantum discretum. Okay. To suppose that in every organized whole, every part is again organized, and that by thus analyzing the parts in infinitum, we should meet again and again with new organized parts. I think this is what Leibniz said. In fact, that the whole is organized in infinitum, this is an unthinkable supposition, even though it is possible to think that the parts of matter decomposed in infinitum might become organized. Oh, this highlighter's dead. For the infinity of the division of a given appearance in space is founded solely on the fact that mere divisibility, that is, an entirely indeterminate multitude of parts, is given through this appearance, while the parts themselves are only given and determined through the subdivision. In short, that the whole is not itself already divided, but it takes a regression, like it takes a division, and is that the... Okay. Thus, in the whole, the division can determine a multitude of parts, which goes as far as we like to go in the regress of division. In an organic body, organized in infinitum, on the contrary, the whole is, through this very concept of an organic body, represented as divided, and a multitude of parts, in itself determinate and yet infinite, is found in it prior to every regress of division. This is self-contradictory, right? For we should have to consider, it sounds like it, those last two sentences, like something can't be divided. I don't know. This is self-contradictory, for we should have to consider this infinite involution as a never-to-be-completed series, infinite, and yet also as completed when in a collection. Okay. Infinite division marks only appearance as a quantum continuum and is inseparable from the occupation of space, because in this very occupation lies the ground of endless divisibility. But as soon as something is taken as a quantum discretum, the multitude of its units in it is determinate, and is therefore at all times equal to some number. How far the organization in an organized body may go is something that experience alone can show us, but even though it never arrived with certainty at any inorganic part, such parts would at least still have to lie in possible experience. Okay. It is different with the transcendental division of an appearance. How far it may extend is not a matter of experience, but a principle of reason. Right. This is like theoretical kind of reason. In its decomposition of what is extended, according to the nature of this appearance, as at any time... sorry, I gotta reread that. I got a text and got distracted. How far it may extend is not a matter of experience, but of a principle of reason. How far it may extend is not a matter, but a principle of reason, right? We're doing this like logically and like trying to figure out how far it extends. We're not actually experiencing it, which never allows us to consider the empirical regress in the decomposition of what is extended, according to the nature of this appearance, as at any time absolutely completed. Okay. Concluding remarks on the solution of the mathematical transcendental ideas, and preliminary remark on the solution of dynamical transcendental ideas. Okay. When exhibiting in a tabular form the antinomy of pure reason through all the transcendental ideas, and indicating the ground of the conflict, and the only means of removing it, by declaring both opposed assertions to be false, we always represented the conditions as belonging to that which they conditioned, according to the relations of space and time, this being the ordinary presupposition of the common understanding, and in fact, the ground from which the conflict arose. Okay, being the ordinary presupposition of the common... Okay. In this respect, all dialectical representations... remember, Kant is using dialectical to mean like some sort of faulty reasoning. Or dialectic, rather. But in this respect, all dialectical representations of the totality in a series of conditions of a given conditioned were indeed always, always of the same character. There was always a series in which the condition was connected with the conditioned as members of the same series, both being thus homogeneous. In such a series, the regress was never thought as completed, or if it was, then one of the members, being in itself conditioned, must wrongly be assumed to be a first member, and therefore to be unconditioned. Because we can't actually experience the unconditioned, I think. Although the object, that is, the conditioned, was not always considered merely according to its magnitude, yet the series of its conditions was. And thus arose the difficulty, which could not be removed by any compromise, but only by cutting the knot, that reason made the series either too long or too short for the understanding, so that the understanding could in neither case match up to the idea of reason. Oh my god. Sorry, I just texted my wife because the baby's screaming. I'm asking her if she wants me to try to get her to sleep. She's in my wife's arms currently, the baby. But in all this, we have overlooked an essential distinction between the objects, that is, the concepts of the understanding, which reason tries to raise to ideas. Okay. Two of them, according to the above table of categories, imply a mathematical. The remaining two a dynamical synthesis of appearances. Okay, so we have 4 examples. 2 imply a mathematical, the other a dynamical synthesis, okay? Hitherto, overlooking this distinction was of no great importance. For just as in the general representation of all transcendental ideas, we have always been conforming to conditions in appearance. For just as in the general representation of all transcendental ideas, we have always been conforming to conditions in appearance, right? So with regard to the 2 mathematical transcendental ideas, we also had no object, but only the one in appearance. Now, however, as we have come to consider the dynamical concepts of the understanding, insofar as they should be rendered adequate to the idea of reason, that distinction becomes important and opens I don't understand what it is exactly, but and opens to us an entirely new insight into the character of the suit in which reason is implicated. That suit had previously been dismissed as resting on both sides on false presuppositions. Now, however, as there seems to be in the dynamical antinomy such a presupposition as may be compatible with the pretensions of reason, and as the judge himself compensates, perhaps, for the deficiency of legal grounds, which has been misunderstood on both sides, the suit may possibly be settled. Pretensions of reasons on both sides, okay. From this point of view, to the satisfaction of both parties, which was impossible in the conflict of the mathematical antinomy. If we consider merely the extension of the series of conditions, and whether they are adequate to the idea, or whether the idea is too large or is too small for those series, the series are no doubt all homogeneous, but the concept of the understanding on which these ideas are founded may contain either only a synthesis of the homogeneous, which is presupposed in the composition as well as the division of every magnitude, or a synthesis of the heterogeneous. This heterogeneous can at least be admitted as possible in the dynamical synthesis, both in a causal connection and in the connection of the necessary with the contingent. Okay. You need to start explaining. Just say, like, which ones are mathematical? I'm assuming the first 2, like, would that be length and width of the universe? Like, does it have a beginning, and is there an outer, is it infinite? There's a mathematical, and for the other 2, those are dynamical? I'm not sure. Thus it happens that none but a sensible condition can enter into the mathematical connection of a series of appearances, that is, a condition of which is itself part of the series, while the dynamical series of sensible conditions admits also of a heterogeneous condition. Okay, what? Dude. Thus it happens that none but a sensible condition, okay, can enter into the mathematical connection of a series of appearances. Okay, that kind of makes sense, I guess. That is, a condition which is itself part of the series, while the dynamical series of sensible condition admits only of a heterogeneous condition, which is not a part of the series, but is merely intelligible outside of it. I don't know what the fuck he's talking about at all. Okay. Thus, a certain satisfaction is given Thus, a certain satisfaction is given to reason, as the unconditioned is placed prior to the appearances without disturbing the series of appearances, which is always conditioned, or breaking it off, contrary to the principles of the understanding. Owing to the fact that dynamical ideas admit of a condition of appearances that lie outside of their series, that is, a condition which itself is not an appearance, something arises here which is totally different from the result of the mathematical antinomy. It sounds like what he's getting at a little bit with the dynamical versus mathematical is like spontaneous movement. Like if it's mathematical, nothing is spontaneous, and therefore like me moving out of my chair was caused by something previous in the chain of causation. Whereas if it's dynamical or dynamic, something else could, maybe outside of the chain, my volition could cause me to get out of the chair. The result of this antinomy was that both the opposed dialectical assertions had to be declared false. In the dynamical series, by contrast, the thoroughly conditioned, which is inseparable from the series of appearances, can be connected with the condition which, although empirically unconditioned, is yet at the same time nonsensible. We may thus obtain satisfaction from the understanding on the one hand, and for reason on the other. Thus vanish the dialectical arguments in some way or the other, sought unconditioned totality in mere appearances, while propositions of reason, if thus amended in their meaning, can both be true. Okay. This cannot be the case with the cosmological ideas, which refer only to the mathematical, unconditioned unity, because in them no condition can be found in the series of appearances, which is not itself appearance, and as such is one of the members of the series. Okay, not sure I got much of that. Alright. Section 3, solution of the cosmological ideas of totality in the derivation of cosmic events and their causes. So I went back and watched some stuff related to the previous sections to make sure I was understanding stuff. And, I think I kind of generally get what Kant is going to do in this section, so, but we'll see. We can conceive only two kinds of causality with regard to events, namely causality either according to nature or from freedom. Okay? Makes sense. Nature would just be like the continuous cause of, things that happened previously, and freedom would be obviously some spontaneous. I guess that would be dynamical. Maybe that's what he's getting at. The former is the connection of one state in the world of sense with a preceding state, upon which it follows according to a rule. As the causality of appearances depends on conditions of time, and as the preceding state, if it had always existed, could not have produced an effect which first arises in time, it follows that the causality of the cause of that which happens or arises must, according to the principle of the understanding, in turn itself require a cause. Yeah. By freedom, on the contrary, in its cosmological meaning, understand the faculty of beginning a state spontaneously. Okay? Its causality, therefore, does not depend, according to the law of nature, on another cause, by which it is determined in time. In this sense, freedom is a pure transcendental idea. Pure transcendental idea, which firstly contains nothing derived from experience. That makes sense, yeah, because it's spontaneous. And secondly, the object of this idea cannot be given determinately in any experience, because there is a universal law of the very possibility of all experience, according to which everything that happens must have a cause, and according to which, therefore, the causality of the cause, which itself has happened or arisen, must also in turn have a cause. In this manner, the whole field of experience, however far it may extend, has been changed into the sum total of mere nature. As, however, it is impossible in this way to arrive at an absolute totality of the conditions in causal relations, reason creates for itself the idea of spontaneity, which can begin to act of itself, right, without an antecedent cause, determining it to action, according to the law of causal connection. Okay. Kind of get that. It is extremely remarkable that the practical concept of freedom is founded on the transcendental idea of freedom, which constitutes the very difficulty which at all times has surrounded the question of the possibility of freedom. What? It is extremely remarkable that the practical concept of freedom, okay, is founded on the transcendental idea of freedom. Okay? That's kind of what we're talking about above the potential options there, which constitutes the very difficulty which at all times has surrounded the question of the possibility of freedom. Okay. In other words, like, this permeates our idea of the practical, like, in our everyday life of thinking of freedom. It's not just, like, something philosophers, well, maybe it is something just philosophers wonder about, but, like, it does affect, in a way, maybe that the other things he's talked about in the book don't necessarily, but this affects, you know, all of our decisions, right? As opposed to, like, I don't know, the transcendental unity of apperception or whatever doesn't, you know, doesn't necessarily arise when we're thinking of, like, how things function in our day-to-day life. The same way that this does, at least. Freedom, in its practical sense, is the independence of our will from coercion through impulses of sensibility. Our will is sensible insofar as it is affected pathologically by impulses of sensibility. It is animal will if it can be necessitated pathologically. Okay. The human will is an arbitrium sensitivum, not, however, brutum, but liberum. Great. Thanks, Kant. Like, why the fuck can't that be in an actual footnote instead of an endnote? God. I guess all the dicks that took Latin in private school probably get this first try. Okay, so arbitrium sensitivum is sensible will, not brute. Oh, Wait, is this like... So, sensible will, not animal but free. Wait, okay. Sensible will. The human will is a sensitive will, a sensible will, excuse me. Not, however, animal but free. Okay. For sensible impulses do not necessitate its action, but there is in human beings a faculty of self-determination, independent of the necessitation through sensible impulses. And I think I was listening to something that was effectively explaining this is pretty consistent with how we actually understand humans to function, right? Like, I had it, but I lost it. We talk about certain things being like necessary, like necessary versus well, maybe not necessary, but what was the example that Professor Gijsbers used? I'm blanking on it now. There's no expectation for certain things in like the Like it's fire. It's like you wouldn't expect it to. Oh my god, expectation is not the right word. I'm just gonna move on because I lost it. I had it for a second, and now I'm just gonna reread that. The human will is certainly okay, for sensible impulses do not necessitate its action, but there is in human beings a faculty of self-determination, independent of the necessitation through sensible impulses. It can easily be seen that if all causality in the world of sense were merely nature, every event would be determined in time through another, according to necessary laws. Since appearances, therefore, in determining the will, would render every action necessary as their natural effect, the removal of transcendental freedom would at the same time destroy all practical freedom. Okay, that makes sense. Practical freedom presupposes that although something has not happened, it ought to have happened. Yeah, that's what it was. Ought versus... Okay. And that the cause of this something in appearance, therefore, did not have the determining force which could prevent causality of our will from producing independently of those natural causes, and even contrary to the force and influence, something that in order of time is determined according to empirical laws, and from originating a series of events entirely of itself. That was the thing I was looking for. Ought to. Like, we often use like ought for humans, right? Like somebody ought to do this, like you ought to feel that way. But we never, it doesn't really apply to non-human things. Like fire ought not to be hot, or it ought to be hot. It doesn't really matter. Like what we think should be the case. Things are the case, and or they aren't the case. And so in that sense, it does, at least our language seems to presuppose some sort of volition and awareness that is separate and apart from like the physical and animal world, potentially. What happens here is what happens generally in the conflict of reason venturing beyond the limits of possible experience, namely, that the problem is not physiological, but transcendental. Hence, the question of the possibility of freedom no doubt concerns psychology, but since it is founded on dialectical arguments of pure reason, its treatment and solution belong entirely to transcendental philosophy. Okay, in order to enable this philosophy to give a satisfactory answer, which it cannot decline to do, I must try to determine more accurately the proper procedure of transcendental philosophy in this task. If appearances were things in themselves, and therefore space and time forms the existence of things in themselves, then the conditions together with the conditioned would always belong as members to one and the same series, and thus there would arise, in our case also, the antinomy, which is common to all transcendental ideas. Namely, that series is inevitably too large or too small for the understanding. The dynamical concepts of reason, however, which we have to discuss in this and the following section, dynamical concepts of reason, have the peculiarity that, as they are not concerned with an object considered as a magnitude, but only with its existence, we can also abstract from the magnitude of the series of conditions. Okay, all that matters here is the dynamical relation of conditions to the conditioned. So that in the question of nature and freedom, we meet at once with the difficulty as to whether freedom is indeed possible, and whether, if it is possible, it can exist together with the universality of the natural law of causality. Okay. The question, in fact, arises whether it is a correct disjunctive proposition to say that every effect in the world must arise either from nature or from freedom, or whether both can coexist in the same event in different relations. Interesting. The correctness of the principle of the thoroughgoing connection of all events in the world of sense, according to unchangeable natural laws, is firmly established by the transcendental analytic. The correctness of the principle of the thoroughgoing connection of all events in the world of sense. Okay. According to unchangeable natural laws, is firmly established in the transcendental analytic and admits of no limitation. The question, therefore, can only be whether, in spite of it, freedom can also be found in the same effect that is determined by nature, or whether freedom is entirely excluded by that inviolable rule. Sorry, what is the rule? I need my other colored pen. The thoroughgoing connection of all events in the world of sense. Okay, that's indisputable, I guess. So if everything is connected, that implies some sort of causation. And that's kind of what Kant gets at as his definition of causation in like the three examples or whatever the hell it was. Okay. And so does freedom enter into that equation? Here, the common but fallacious presupposition of the absolute reality of appearances at once shows its pernicious influence in confusing reason. Okay. Absolute reality confuses reason. For if appearances are things in themselves, freedom cannot be saved. Why? Okay. Nature, in that case, is the complete and in itself sufficient determining cause of every event, and its condition is always contained only in that series of appearances which, together with their effect, are necessary under the law of nature. All right. Okay, that kind of makes sense. If they're things in themselves, then they're kind of like self-determined. Like they don't... Yeah. They don't depend in any way on us or our participation. But I think Kant's going to introduce us as like the freedom agents in this equation. And it's possible because we're dealing with appearances as opposed to things in themselves. If, on the contrary, appearances are taken for nothing except what they are in reality, namely not for things in themselves, but for mere representations connected with one another according to empirical laws, they must themselves have no grounds. They must themselves have grounds which are not appearances. Okay, I guess. Such an intelligible cause, however, is not determined with reference to its causality by appearances, although its effects appear and can thus be determined by other appearances. This intelligible cause, therefore, together with its causality, is outside the series, although its effects are to be found in the series of empirical conditions. Hence the effect can, with reference to its intelligible cause, be considered as free, and yet at the same time with reference to appearances as resulting from and according to the necessity of nature. So it can kind of be both, okay? This distinction, if thus presented in a general and entirely abstract form, may seem extremely subtle and obscure, but it will become clear in its application. Here I only wish to remark that since the thoroughgoing connection of all appearances in one context of nature is an inexorable law, it would necessarily destroy all freedom. The thoroughgoing connection, would destroy all freedom if we were to defend obstinately the reality of appearances. Those, therefore, who follow the common opinion of the subject have never been able to reconcile nature and freedom. Okay. Possibility of a causality through freedom in harmony with the universal law of natural necessity. Possibility of causality through freedom in harmony with the universal law of natural necessity. So some dash of freedom within our universal law of natural necessity, things being necessary in a causal chain, presumably. Okay. Whatever in an object of the senses is not itself appearance, I call intelligible. Okay. If therefore what in the world of sense must be considered as appearance possesses in itself a faculty that is not the object of sensible intuition, but through which it can still become the cause of appearances, so some sort of cause that can't be perceived, then the causality of this being may be considered from two sides: as intelligible according to its action, taken as the action of a thing in itself, and as sensible according to the effects of its causality. Right, so it's the cause isn't sensible, it's intelligible, but then when it causes something, it can then become sensible through causing what it caused, which are taken as an appearance in the world of sense. Concerning the faculty of such a subject, we should have to form both an empirical and an intellectual concept, of causality, both of which occur together in one and the same effect. Interesting. This twofold way of conceiving the faculty of an object of the senses does not contradict any of the concepts which we have to form of appearances and of a possible experience. For as these appearances are not in themselves things, they must have for their foundations a transcendental object determining them as mere representations. Yeah. Because they're not things in themselves. Okay. Consequently, there is nothing to prevent us from attributing to this transcendental object, besides the property through which it appears, also a causality that is not appearance. A causality which is not appearance, although its effect is found in appearance. So there could, in a way, it's kind of like communicating with the thing in itself, which could be causing in some way the appearances. And the thing in itself would not necessarily be, or presumably would be, a chain of causation, which is that doesn't involve freedom. Kant talked about that kind of in the last section, right? Every efficient cause, however, must have a character that is a law of its causality, which, without which it would not be a cause. According to this, every subject of the world of sense we should have firstly an empirical character, through which its actions as appearances stand in thoroughgoing connection with other appearances, okay, according to permanent laws of nature, and could be derived from these appearances as their conditions. And so in connection with those appearances, these actions would form the members of one and the same series in the order of nature. Secondly, we should also have to allow it also an intelligible character, through which, it is true, the subject becomes the cause of the same actions as appearances, but which itself is not subject to any conditions of sensibility, and is not itself an appearance. I think I have to reread both of those. Okay, so firstly, according to this, in every subject of the world of sense, we should have firstly an empirical character. Hold on, I gotta get my red pen out. Firstly, an empirical character, through which its actions as appearances stand in thoroughgoing connection with other appearances, according to the permanent laws of nature, and could be derived from these appearances as their conditions. Okay. And so in connection with those appearances, these actions would form the members of one and the same series in the order of nature. Got it. Secondly, we should also have to allow it also an intelligible character. Okay, so there's an empirical character first, and then there's an intelligible character, through which it is true the subject becomes the cause of the same actions as appearances, but which itself is not subject to any conditions of sensibility, and is not itself appearance. We might call the former the character of such a thing in appearance, and the latter the character of the thing in itself. Okay, so the intelligible would be kind of some unseen character which causes something, even though we are only able to see the cause in appearances, because appearances are all that we see. We don't see things in themselves. Which itself is not subject to any conditions of sensibility, and is not itself appearance. I think that would be the cause, right? Okay. So an empirical character and an intelligible character. Empirical character is the world of appearances. Intelligible character is things in themselves and some sort of unseen cause, presumably interacting with the empirical character or appearances as we experience them. According to its intelligible character, this acting subject, people, right? I think, would not depend on conditions of time, for time is only the condition of appearances and not of things in themselves. Transcendental aesthetic. Right? In it, no action would arise or perish, and hence neither would it be subject to the law of determination of time, and of all that is alterable, namely, that everything which happens must have its cause in the appearances of the previous state. Okay, in it no action would arise or perish, and hence neither would it be subject to the law of determination of time, and all that is alterable, namely, that everything which happens must have its cause in the appearances. In a word, its causality, insofar as it is intellectual, would not have a place in the series of empirical conditions by which the event is rendered necessary in the world of sense. Okay. It is true that this intelligible character could never be known immediately, because we cannot perceive anything, except insofar as it appears. Makes sense. But it would nevertheless have to be thought according to the empirical character, just as we must always admit in thought a transcendental object as the foundation of appearances, though we know nothing of what it is in itself. Fair. In its empirical character, therefore, this subject, as appearance, would be subjected according to all laws of determination, to a causal connection. And in that respect, it would be nothing but a part of the world of sense. And its effects, like every other appearance, would arise from nature without fail. In the same way as outer appearances would influence it, and in the same way as its empirical character, that is, the law of its causality, would have to be known through experience. All its actions ought to admit of an explanation according to the laws of nature, and all that is requisite for its complete and necessary determination would be found in a possible experience. Excuse me. But in its intelligible character, though we can only have a general concept of this character, this is like the unseen, like whatever, thing in itself, the same subject would have to be considered free from all influence of sensibility and from all determination through appearances. And as in this subject, insofar as it is noumenon, nothing happens, and as no alteration is found in it which requires dynamical determination of time, and therefore no connection with appearances as causes, this active being would thus be quite independent and free in its actions from all natural necessity, which is found only in the world of sense. So Kant is like carving out this like privileged place for humans. And like I've known this from like watching other stuff related to this. But I'm not sure I'm entirely... So there's a world of appearances which is separate from ourselves, and then there's ourselves. And in a way, like, we are not... You know, we're aware of ourselves, not necessarily as appearances, probably closer, not as a thing in itself, for sure, either, but not as an appearance either, because that would be kind of weird, because we're not just experiencing ourselves. We have some sort of self, some actual being, awareness, something. And so, in a way, the appearances that we experience are things, they're appearances, they're not things in themselves, but they are subject to the empirical rules of appearances. And so we're able to experience those things and see those things, but we're also able to effectively exist outside of them as not mere appearances. And maybe we have a privileged position insofar as we are like, we talked about the ought to versus not ought to. Like we don't think about anything else besides really ourselves. That's kind of where ethics and morals come in, as beings that ought to do something or ought to be something or feel something or anything else. So we kind of already consider ourselves in a privileged position in that sense. And so Kant is carving this out for us to be, for freedom for individuals, but also the recognition that causality in a very real way is this linear thing that that determines a lot of things as appearances. But we do have, within that system, the ability to cause things and change things and have general freedom. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. One might say of it quite correctly that it begins its effects in the world of sense of itself. Is he talking about like us? Though the action does not begin in this active being's itself. Okay. There's a hair on my keyboard. Just trying to get it off. And this would be perfectly true, though the effects in the world of sense need not therefore originate of themselves. For in it they are always predetermined through empirical conditions in the previous time. though only by means of empirical character, which is merely the appearance of the intelligible character, and are therefore impossible except as a continuum of the series of natural causes, like I just talked about. There's still the continuum, but we exist adjacent to it and can affect it in certain ways. In this way, freedom and nature, each in the complete significance of its term, would exist together, and without any conflict in the same action. This is pretty fascinating. I need to reread it for sure, probably a few times, but according to whether we refer these actions to their intelligible or to their sensible cause. Okay. Next kind of subsection. Explanation of the cosmological idea of freedom. Explanation of the cosmological idea of freedom in connection with the universal necessity of nature. Okay, so this is like the bulk of this section. The cosmological idea of freedom, okay, in connection with the universal necessity of nature. I thought it best to give first this sketch of the solution of our transcendental problem, so that the course which reason has to adopt in its solution might be more clearly surveyed. We shall now proceed to explain more fully the factors involved in deciding this solution and examine each by itself. Great, because I'm still pretty lost here. The law of nature, that everything which happens has a cause, that the causality of this cause, that is, its action, as it proceeds in time and with regard to an effect which has arisen, cannot itself have always existed, but must have happened at some time, must have its cause among the appearances by which it is determined. Okay. And that therefore all events in the order of nature are empirically determined. This law, I say, through which alone appearances constitute a nature and become objects of experience, is a law of the understanding. Interesting. A law of the understanding. I'm gonna get the red pen out for that part. Which can on no account be surrendered, and from which no single appearance can be exempted. For in allowing such exemption, we should place the appearance outside all possible experience, distinguish it from all objects of possible experience, and change it into a mere thought entity or figment of the brain. Okay. That's what's necessary for it to like exist as an appearance. And like an empirical point. But although this looks merely like a chain of causes, which in regress to its conditions admits of no absolute totality, this difficulty does not detain us in the least. Well, that's good. For it has already been removed in the general judgment on the antinomy of reason when, starting from the series of appearances, reason aims at the unconditioned. Were we to yield to the illusion of transcendental realism, we should be left with neither nature nor freedom. The question here is if we recognize in the whole series of events nothing but natural necessity. The question here is, okay. We may yet regard the same event, which on one side is merely an effect of nature, as on the other side being an effect of freedom. or whether there is a direct contradiction between these two kinds of causality. There can certainly be nothing among the causes and appearances that could begin a series absolutely and of itself. Every action as an appearance, insofar as it produces an event, is itself an event, presupposing another state, in which its cause can be found. And thus everything that happens is only a continuation of the series, and no beginning that happens of itself is possible in it. Actions of natural causes in the succession of time are therefore themselves again effects, which likewise presuppose causes in the series of time. Okay, makes sense to me. An original bold action by which something takes place, and not an original action by which something takes place that did not exist before, cannot be expected from the causal connection of appearances. Okay, but what about humans? Can we introduce that? But is it really necessary that if effects are appearances, the causality of their cause, which cause itself is also appearance, could be nothing but empirical? But is it really necessary that if effects are appearances, the causality of their cause, which cause itself is also appearance, could be nothing but empirical? Okay, not sure I understand that exactly. Or is it not possible, although for every effect in appearance a connection with its cause, according to the laws of empirical causality, is certainly required, that this empirical causality itself could nevertheless, without breaking in the least its connection with the natural causes, be an effect of a non-empirical but intelligible causality. That is, of the action original with respect to appearances of a cause, which is so far not appearance, but with respect to this faculty intelligible, although it must, as a link in the chain of nature, be regarded as entirely belonging to the world of sense. Is he talking about, like, it isn't necessarily like the disconnection of, oh man, cause and no, things in themselves and intelligible causes in some way causing and affecting. I use that in kind of a general way. The empirical appearances that we actually witness, there's no reason there can't be some connection with those two things necessarily. Could be true that they that they somehow interact. At least there's no reason it's not possible. I think that's what he's getting at. We require the principle of the causality of appearances among themselves. Require the principle of the causality of appearances among themselves, in order to be able to look for and to indicate natural conditions, that is, causes in appearance, for natural events. Is that the end of the sentence? It feels like half a sentence. We require the principle of causality. So we require the principle of causality of appearances among themselves. Causality of appearances among themselves. Okay, so like appearances, there's cause and effect in appearances as we empirically experience them. We require that in order to be able to look for and indicate natural conditions. It's kind of like science and like just observing the world and figuring out what the hell's going on. That is, causes in appearance for natural events. If this is admitted and not weakened by any exceptions, then the understanding, which in its empirical use recognizes in all events nothing but nature, and is quite justified in doing so, has really all that it can demand, and the physical explanations may proceed without let or hindrance. The understanding would not be wronged in the least if we assumed, though it be a mere fiction, that among the natural causes, some have a faculty which is only intelligible. Okay? So some causes are only intelligible, inasmuch as its determination to action never rests on empirical conditions, but on mere grounds of the understanding, and rests on these grounds in such a way that the action of this cause in appearance is in accordance with all the laws of empirical causality. For in this way, the acting subject, as cause of phenomenon, would be joined with nature through the indissoluble dependence of all its actions, and only the phenomenon of this subject, with all its causality and appearance, would contain certain conditions which, if we want to ascend from the empirical to the transcendental object, would have to be considered as merely intelligible. Is that like us? For if we only follow the rule of nature, in that which may be the cause among appearances, it is indifferent to us what kind of ground of those appearances and of their connection may have to be thought as existing in the transcendental subject, which is empirically unknown to us. This intelligible ground does not touch the empirical questions, but concerns only, as it would seem, thought in the pure understanding. And although the effects of this thought and action of the pure understanding may be discovered in the appearances, these appearances must nevertheless be capable of complete explanation from their cause in appearance, according to the laws of nature. Okay. So even if there are some intelligible effects within the determinable empirical causal chain, that doesn't, the empirical things will still be definable and determinable by just looking at the actual empirical causes. So, like, even though I'm an agent that could, I don't know, excuse me, like throw a ball downward, at more than the rate at which it would fall, sure, that could happen, but that doesn't mean that, like, I can't calculate what the rate at which an object falls in the world consistently based on the empirical laws, physical laws in that world. Okay. Such explanation requires taking their empirical character as the supreme ground of explanation, and bypassing the intelligible character, which is the transcendental cause of the empirical character, is entirely unknown, except insofar as the intelligible is indicated by the empirical character as its sensible sign, throwing the ball. Let us apply this to experience. The human being is one among the appearances of the world of sense, and as such, one of the natural causes, the causality of which must be subject to empirical laws. As such a cause, he must, therefore, have an empirical character, like all other objects in nature. We perceive this character through the powers and faculties which he shows in his effects. In the lifeless or merely animal nature, We see no ground for admitting any faculty other than one which would be sensibly conditioned. The human being, however, who knows all the rest of nature only through his senses, knows himself also through mere apperception. Seems important. And this in actions and inner determinations which he cannot regard as impressions of the senses. So we know ourselves in a much different way than we just know things in the world. The human being is thus to himself partly a phenomenon, partly, however, namely, is that right? Partly, however, namely with reference to certain faculties, a merely intelligible object, because the actions of the object cannot be ascribed to the receptivity of sensibility. With reference to certain faculties, a merely intelligible object, because the actions of this object cannot be ascribed to the receptivity of sensibility. We call these faculties understanding and reason. Understanding and reason, okay. It is the latter, reason, in particular, which is entirely distinguished from all empirically conditioned powers, because it considers its objects merely according to ideas, and in accordance with them determines the understanding, which then makes empirical use of its own, similarly pure, concepts. That our reason possesses causality, or that we at least conceive such a causality in it, is clear from the imperatives. That our reason possesses causality. Our reason possesses causality. Crazy. Okay. That our reason possesses causality, or that we at least conceive such a causality in it, is clear through the imperatives, which in all practical matters we impose as rules on our executive powers. The ought, we talked about this earlier, expresses a kind of necessity and connection with grounds that we do not find elsewhere in the whole of nature. Right. The understanding can know in nature only what is, what has been, or what will be. It is impossible that anything in nature ought to be different from what in fact it is in all these relations of time. So he's finally getting to the point that I talked about like 5 times at this point, and have been looking for. Nay, if we only look to the course, if we only look at the course of nature, the ought has no meaning whatsoever. We cannot ask what ought to happen in nature, as little as we can ask what qualities a circle ought to possess. We can only ask what happens in nature and what properties the circle has. This ought expresses a possible action, the ground of which cannot be anything but a mere concept. While in every merely natural action, the ground must always be an appearance. Now it is quite true that the action to which the ought applies must be possible under natural conditions. Okay. That the ought applies, which, okay. But these natural conditions do not affect the determination of the will itself, but only its effects and results in appearances. There may be ever so many natural grounds which impel me to will. There may be ever so many natural grounds which impel me to will, and ever so many sensible impulses, but they cannot produce the ought, but only a willing, which is always conditioned and by no means necessary, and to which the ought, pronounced by reason, opposes measure and goal, nay, more, prohibition and authority. Whether it be an object of mere sensibility, the pleasant, or of pure reason, the good, reason does not yield to an empirically given ground, and does not follow the order of things as they present themselves in appearance, but frames for itself with perfect spontaneity an order of its own, according to ideas, to which it adapts the empirical conditions, and according to which it declares actions to be necessary, even though they have not taken place, and maybe never will take place. Interesting. Yeah, reason, okay, this makes a lot of sense. Yet reason presupposes that it can have causality with respect to them. Doesn't mean it can't, though. For otherwise, it would not expect effects in experience to result from its ideas. Okay, I'm with you, Kant. I am getting tired, though. Now let us take our stand here and admit that it is at least possible that reason really possesses causality with reference to appearances. It's possible, yeah. In that case, reason though it be, it must still show an empirical character. Because every cause presupposes a rule according to which certain appearances follow as effects, and every rule requires in the effects a uniformity on which the concept of cause, as a faculty, is founded. This, insofar as it is exhibited by mere appearances, may be called the empirical character of the cause. Right, so how does... Yeah. I mean, it's not that hard of a question. Is it like, if we do have the will... It's not. It almost sounds a little bit like the mind-body duality being an issue, right? Where it's like, okay, so if those two things exist separately, like at what point do they come into contact? Where it's like, you know, here you have the some sort of intelligible morality, you know, based. Sensibility-based actor within the world. How does that morality / sensibility then connect with the world in order to become a cause? And I guess it's like just through us. Is the answer. It's not, yeah, exactly the same. Okay. This character is permanent, while the effects, according to a diversity of the concomitant and in part limiting conditions, appear in alterable forms. Thus the will of every human being has an empirical character. The will of every human being has an empirical character. The will of every human being has an empirical character. I gotta get the red pen out for that one. Which is nothing but a certain causality of his reason, exhibiting in its effects in appearance a rule, according to which he may gather the grounds of reason and its actions, both in kind and in degree, and thus judge the subjective principles of his will. As this empirical character itself must be derived from appearances as its effect, and from their rule, which is supplied by experience, so all the actions of the human being, insofar as they are appearances, are determined from his empirical character, and from the other concomitant causes, according to the order of nature. Are other people appearances? Only I am? Is it only I am, like, not an appearance because I have my apperception and stuff, but I obviously don't have the ability to do that with others. Okay, where was I? As this empirical character must itself be derived from appearances as its effect, and from their rule, which is supplied by experience, so all the actions of a human being, insofar as they are appearances, are determined from his empirical character and from the other concomitant causes, according to the order of nature. And if we could investigate all the appearances of his will down to the very bottom, there would be not a single human action which we could not predict with certainty and recognize from its preceding conditions as necessary. Really? There's no freedom, therefore, with regard to this empirical character. And yet it is only with reference to this character that we can consider the human being by merely observing him. So, okay. So the will of every human being has an empirical character, but it also has an intelligible character, which is controllable by the human being? Interesting. Okay. Not what I was expecting. But he said, that should have been read, I read it about 5 times, has an empirical character. Okay. So effectively you can just, zeros and ones, figure out a person's experience and figure out, just math out what they're going to do. And, as is the case in anthropology, by trying to investigate the motivating causes of his actions physiologically. If, however, we consider the same actions with reference to reason, not speculative reason, in order to explain their origin, but reason solely insofar as it is the cause producing them. In a word, if we compare these actions with reason in reference to practical purposes, then we find a rule and order totally different from the order of nature. Wait, what? If, however, we consider the same actions with reference to reason, okay. So we're talking about reason instead of will? Is that the distinction he's making? So thus the will of every human being has an empirical character, but the reason of every human being has an intelligible character, I guess? I don't know. If, however, we consider the same actions with reference to a reason, not speculative reason in order to explain their origin, but reason solely insofar as it is the cause producing them. In a word, if we compare these actions with the reason in reference to practical purposes, then we find a rule and order totally different from the order of nature. For from this point of view, it may be that everything ought not to have happened, which according to the course of nature yet has happened, and according to its empirical grounds was inevitable. Okay, so the reason makes it just like exists outside of the will. The will is the natural empirical part of stuff. And reason can kind of sidestep the will, the empirical will, and the, necessary nature of that stuff. And that's where the freedom aspect comes in. And sometimes we find, or believe at least that we find, that the ideas of reason have really proved their causality with regard to human actions, as appearances, and that these actions have taken place, not because they were determined by empirical causes, but because they were determined by grounds of reason. Now, supposing one could say that reason possesses causality in reference to appearances, could the action of reason be called free in that case, when it is precisely determined by the empirical character of reason, way of sensing, and rendered necessary by it? Doesn't sound like freedom. That character, in turn, is determined in the intelligible character. Way of thinking. The latter, however, we do not know, but we indicate it only by means of appearances, which really yield us immediate knowledge only of the way of sensing, empirical character. Footnote. The true morality of actions, merit or guilt, even that of our own conduct, remains therefore entirely hidden to us. Our imputations can refer only to the empirical character. How much of that may be the pure effect of freedom, and how much should be ascribed to mere nature, that is, to the faults of temperament, for which a person is not responsible, or its happy constitution, no one can answer, and no one can judge with perfect justice. Whew, yeah, Professor Gijsbers talked about that footnote. I didn't really fully get what it was getting at until I read it right now, but yeah. An action, insofar as it is to be attributed to the way of thinking as its cause, nevertheless does not result from it according to empirical laws. That is, it is not preceded by the conditions of pure reason, but only by their effects in appearance of inner sense. Pure reason, as a merely intelligible faculty, is not subject to the form of time, or to the conditions of the succession of time. Pure reason is not subject to the conditions of time. Interesting. And therefore it can be free. The causality of reason in its intelligible character does not arise or begin at a certain time in order to produce an effect. For in that case, it would be subject to the natural law of appearances. The causality of reason in its intelligible character does not arise or begin at a certain time in order to produce an effect. For in that case, it would be subject to the natural law of appearances, which determines all causal series in time. And its causality would then be nature and not freedom. Okay. It does not arise or begin. It's kind of spontaneous. But it doesn't, arise in the same way that, a cause in a causal chain arises, I guess. Hence, what we can say is that if reason can possess causality with regard to appearances, then it is a faculty through which the sensible condition of an empirical series of effects first begins. Okay. I gotta get the red pen out again. For the condition that lies in reason is not sensible, and therefore does not itself begin. Thus we get that we did not find in all empirical series, namely, thus we get what we did not find in all empirical series, namely the condition of a successive series of events can itself be empirically unconditioned. Empirically unconditioned. Okay. For here the condition is really outside the series of appearances, and therefore is not subject to any sensible condition, nor to any determination of time through a preceding cause. Nevertheless, the same cause belongs also, in another respect, to the series of appearances. A human being itself is an appearance. Its will has an empirical character that is the empirical cause of all its actions, all his actions. It's probably better. Okay, sorry. My throat was getting pretty dry. Nevertheless, the same cause belongs also, in another respect, to the same series of appearances. A human being itself is an appearance. Its will has an empirical character, that is, the empirical cause of all his actions. There is no condition determining a human being according to this character that is not contained in the series of natural effects and subject to their law, according to which there can be no empirically unconditioned causality of anything that happens in time. Okay. Hence, no given action, as it can be perceived only as appearance, can begin absolutely of itself. Of pure reason, however, we cannot say that the state in which it determines the will is preceded by another in which that itself is determined. Okay, I gotta read that again. Pure reason, we cannot say that the state in which it determines the will is preceded by another in which that self... Yeah. So pure reason could be spontaneous. In other words, it doesn't have to be traced backward to an original something. For since reason itself is not an appearance and is not subject to any of the conditions of sensibility, right? There occurs in it, even in reference to its causality, no succession of time. That makes sense. And so the dynamical law of nature, which determines the succession of time according to rules, cannot be applied to reason. Okay, that makes sense. Reason is therefore the constant condition of all voluntary actions under which the human being appears. Even before it happens, every one of these actions... Hold on, wait, what? Reason is therefore the constant condition of all voluntary actions under which the human being appears. Okay, I gotta get the red highlighter, or red pen out. Reason is therefore the constant condition of all voluntary actions under which the human being appears. Even before it happens, every one of these actions is predetermined in the empirical character of human beings prior to becoming actual. But then the reason intervenes or affects that. With regard to the intelligible character, however, of which the empirical character is only the sensible schema, okay? There is no before or after, and every action without regard to its relations in time to other appearances is the immediate effect of the intelligible character of pure reason. There is no before or after, and every action without regard to its relations in time to other appearances is the immediate effect of the intelligible character of pure reason. Okay. Hence, reason acts freely. Reason acts freely. That is, without being determined dynamically in the chain of natural causes by outer or inner grounds proceeding in time. This freedom must then not only be regarded negatively as independence of empirical conditions, for in that sense the faculty of reason would cease to be a cause of appearances, but it should be determined also positively as the faculty of beginning spontaneously in a series of events. Okay, so freedom is negative. This freedom must then not be regarded as negative, so it's not completely independent of empirical conditions, because some part of our being, including some part of our, I don't know. I don't want to call it reason. Decision-making, experience, whatever, is predetermined. But then reason is a constant condition of all voluntary actions under which the human being appears. it acts freely. It must then not only be regarded negatively as independence of empirical conditions, but it should be determined also positively as the faculty of beginning spontaneously a series of events. Okay. Hence, nothing begins in reason itself, and being itself the unconditioned condition of every voluntary action, reason admits of no condition preceding itself in time, while nevertheless its effect takes its beginning in the series of appearances, though it can never constitute in that series an absolutely first beginning. Okay. Because it is affecting things in a timeline, right? And therefore, like, everything in the timeline outside of human beings is set in this kind of fixed causality. I would say that, like, we aren't truly the first cause of anything, I think is what he's saying. You know, we're just manipulating stuff within the timeline, even though it is spontaneous, potentially. Okay. In order to illustrate the regulative principle of reason by an example of its empirical use, not in order to confirm it, for such proofs are useless for transcendental assertions, let us take a voluntary action. That's a good idea. Remember at the beginning, it was like page 5, Kant was like, I won't put too many examples in here because I want to keep this short. But, like, I feel like examples for each of these things would be so much more helpful. Like, way more examples would be helpful. Let us take a voluntary action, for example, a malicious lie, by which a person has produced a certain confusion in society, and of which we first try to find out the motives from which it arose, and afterwards try to judge how far it and its consequences may be imputed to the offender. With regard to the first point, one has first to follow up his empirical character to its very sources, which are to be found in wrong education, bad company, loose women, just kidding, in part also in the viciousness of a natural disposition, and a nature insensible to shame, and in part we ascribe to the frivolity of heedlessness, not omitting the occasioning causes at the time. Cultural, presumably. In all this, the procedure is exactly the same as the investigation of a series of determining causes of a given natural effect. But although one believes that the action was thus determined, one nevertheless blames the offender. True. Well, I don't know. Not necessarily. Post-Kant, at least. And not on account of his unhappy natural disposition, not on account of influencing circumstances, not even on account of his former course of life. For one supposes one might leave entirely out of consideration what that course of life may have been, and consider the past series of conditions as having never occurred, and the act itself is totally unconditioned by the previous states, as if the offender had begun with it a new series of consequences entirely by himself. This blame is founded on a law of reason, and reason is considered as a cause, which, independent of all the before-mentioned empirical conditioned... Okay, hold on. This blame is founded on a law of reason, and reason is considered as a cause, which, independent of all the before-mentioned empirical conditions, could and should have determined the behavior of the person differently. We do not regard the causality of reason merely as a concurrent agency, but as complete in itself. even though the sensible motives did not favor this causality and even opposed it. The action is imputed to the person's intelligible character. True. Well, for the sake of this example, true. At the moment when he tells the lie, the guilt is entirely his. That is, we regard reason, in spite of all empirical conditions of the act, as completely free, and the act has to be imputed entirely to a default of reason. Such an imputation clearly shows that we consider reason to be unaffected by the influences of the sensibility, and that reason does not alter, although its appearances, that is, the mode in which it manifests itself in its effects, do alter. That in it no state proceeds as determining a following state. In fact, that reason does not belong to the series of sensible conditions which render appearances necessary according to the laws of nature. Reason, it is supposed, is present in all the actions of a human being, in all circumstances of time, and is always the same. But it is itself not in time, never in a new state. I gotta highlight this. Reason, it is supposed, is present in all the actions of a human being, in all the circumstances of time, and is always the same. But it is itself not in time, never in a new state, in which it previously was not. It is determining, not determinable, with regard to that state. That's a good way to put it. We cannot ask, therefore, why reason has not determined itself differently, but only why it has not differently determined the appearances by its causality. Yeah, so we can't ask why reason has not determined itself differently, but only why it has not differently determined the appearances, like meaning the stuff in the world, by its causality, meaning its decision. And here no answer is really possible, for a different intelligible character would have given a different empirical character. And if we say that, irrespective of the whole of his previous course of life, the offender could have avoided the lie, this only means that the lie was immediately subject to the power of reason, and that reason, in its causality, is not subject to any conditions of appearances or of time. And it means, lastly, that the difference of time, though it makes a great difference in appearances and their relation to one another, can produce, since these appearances are neither things nor causes in themselves, no difference of action in reference to reason. We thus see sorry. We thus see that, in judging of free actions, we can, as far as their causality is concerned, only get as far as the intelligible cause, but not beyond it. In judging of free actions, we can We thus see that in judging of free actions, we can, as far as their causality is concerned, only get as far as the intelligible cause, but not beyond it. We can see that this cause is free. I gotta take a break. My wife needs a pacifier, baby's awake. Okay. We thus see that in judging of free actions we can, as far as their causality is concerned, only get as far as the intelligible cause, but not beyond it. We can see that this cause is free. This cause is free. That is, that it determines independently of sensibility, and that therefore it is capable of being the sensibly unconditioned condition of appearances. To explain why that intelligible character should, under present circumstances, give these appearances and this empirical character, and no other, transcends all the powers of our reason, nay, all its rights even of questioning, just as if we were to ask why the transcendental object of our outer sensible intuition gives us intuition in space only, and not some other intuition. Yeah, why questions are hard. But the problem which we have to solve does not require us to ask or to answer such questions. Our problem was whether freedom is in conflict with natural necessity in one and the same action. And this, our problem was whether freedom is in conflict with natural necessity in one hand in the same action. In the same action. In this we have sufficiently answered by showing that freedom may have a relation to a very different kind of condition from those of natural necessity, so that the law of the latter does not affect the law of the former, and the two may exist independently of and undisturbed by each other. Okay. It should be clearly understood that in what we have said, we had no intention of establishing the reality of freedom. As one of the faculties which contains the cause of appearances of the out of our world of sense. As one of the faculties which contain the cause of appearances of our world of sense. For not only would this have been no transcendental consideration at all, which is concerned only with concepts, but it would never have succeeded, because from experience we can never infer something that need not be thought, according to the laws of experience. It was not even our intention to prove the possibility of freedom, for in this too we should have not succeeded. Because from mere a priori concepts we cannot know the possibility of any real ground or any causality. We have here treated freedom only as a transcendental idea, which makes reason imagine that it can absolutely begin. Makes reason imagine that it can absolutely begin the series of conditions in appearances through the sensibly unconditioned. But here, reason becomes involved in an antinomy with its own laws, the laws of which it prescribes in the empirical use of the understanding. That this antinomy rests on a mere illusion, and that nature does not conflict with the causality of freedom. This was the only thing which we were able to show and cared to show. Alright, section 3 done. Section 4. Section 4 is called Solution of the Cosmological Idea of the Totality of the Dependence of Appearances as regards their existence in general. Dependence of appearances. Okay, as regards their existence in general. In the preceding subsection, we considered the alterations in the world of sense in their dynamical series. each alteration being subordinate to another as its cause. Now, however, the series of states is to serve only as our guide, in order to arrive at an existence that might be the highest condition of all that is subject to alteration, namely the necessary being. Now, this is a God question, huh? We are concerned here not with the unconditioned causality, but with the unconditioned existence of substance itself. The unconditioned existence of substance itself. Therefore, the series which we have before us is properly one of concepts and not of intuitions, insofar as one intuition is the condition of the other. It is easy to see, however, that since everything in the sum total of appearances is alterable and therefore conditioned in its existence, any unconditioned member, the existence of which might be considered as absolutely necessary. Okay, that makes sense. And hence we see that if appearances were things in themselves, and if their condition, accordingly, belonged always to one and the same series of intuitions as the conditioned, then a necessary being, as the condition of the existence of the appearances of the world of sense, could never exist. What the fuck? I'm going to read the whole paragraph over. It is easy to see, however, that since everything in the sum total of appearances is alterable, so appearances, world of appearances, everything is alterable, and therefore conditioned in its existence, meaning it can be, can be changed, and therefore it is subject to the laws of cause and effect. There cannot be in the whole series of dependent existence any unconditioned member, the existence of which might be considered absolutely necessary. So meaning if everything can be changed in a way, like everything can, be altered so it's totally unrecognizable, and therefore nothing is necessarily necessary, right? If everything is up for grabs, can be destroyed, burned, whatever, thrown in a particle accelerator, like whatever. And hence we see that if appearances were things in themselves, and if their condition accordingly belonged always to one and the same I tried to make through that sentence. It's just I couldn't. And hence we see that if appearances were things in themselves, and if their condition accordingly belonged always to one and the same series of intuitions as the conditioned, then a necessary being, as the condition of the existence of appearances of the world of sense, could never exist. Okay, so if an unconditioned thing can't exist in a world of all conditioned things, then there can't be an initial, there can't be any unconditioned thing within it, but there certainly couldn't be, presumably, an unconditioned thing that caused it and is the necessary, cause of the universe. Okay. The dynamical regress has a peculiar distinction as compared with the mathematical regress, since the latter, mathematical, is only concerned with the composition. So the mathematical regress is only concerned with the composition of parts to form a whole, or with the division of a whole into its parts. The conditions of the series must always be considered as parts of it, and therefore as homogeneous, and as appearances. By contrast, the dynamical regress, where we are concerned not with the possibility of an unconditioned whole consisting of given parts, or of an unconditioned part belonging to a given whole, but with the derivation of a state from its cause. Yeah, it's a lot different. or with the derivation of the contingent existence of a substance itself from the necessary substance, it is not required that the condition should form one and the same empirical series with the conditioned. So that kind of makes sense. Like, the mathematical part of it is like, okay, we start with, I don't know, 1 trillion, and we can trace it all the way back to 1. Or we start with this is the center of the universe, and we keep going out by 1 until we get to the edge of the universe and figure out how, like, whether it goes on infinitely. Like, those are very, like, in the very least, like, measurable in a sense, unit-based questions. Whereas, so it's in a sense, like, calling it mathematical isn't incorrect. And the other questions are very much, not similar. Like he just said, it's a much more dynamic question than a numerical or mathematical question. So that kind of makes sense, which I don't necessarily think I grasped when he was talking about that distinction a few sections ago, I should say. Therefore, there remains to us another escape from this apparent antinomy. For both conflicting propositions might, under different aspects, be true at the same time. Yeah, and this is what he's saying. So, like, the dynamical ones could both be true, could both be false. I think he thinks the mathematical ones, like, both can't be true and both can't be false. Like, it has to be... doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be a third thing, but they can't. Is that what he's saying? I'd have to think about it for another second. I thought I was saying that pretty confidently. Then I was like, wait a second. Okay, anyway. Cat, please don't jump up here. That is, all things of the world of sense might be entirely contingent and have therefore only an empirically conditioned existence. Therefore, though there might nevertheless be a non-empirical condition. Though there might nevertheless be a non-empirical condition of the whole series, that is, an unconditionally necessary being. For this being, as an intelligible condition, would not belong to the series as a member of it, not even as the supreme member, nor would it render any member of the series empirically unconditioned, but it would leave the whole world of sense in its empirically conditioned existence that permeates all its members. This manner of admitting an unconditioned existence as the ground of appearances would differ from the empirically unconditioned causality, freedom, treated in the preceding subsection, because with respect to freedom, the thing in itself, as cause, belonged to the series of conditions, and only its causality was thought as intelligible. Here, on the contrary, the necessary being has to be conceived as lying outside of the series of the world of sense. Okay, so one's within the series, potentially causing stuff, affecting stuff. The other is like completely like above and outside of the series, potentially causing the entirety of the series. And as merely intelligible. For only thereby can it be guarded against itself, being subject to the law of contingency and dependence of all appearances. Oh, excuse me. The regulative principle of reason, with regard to our present problem, is therefore that everything in the world of sense has an empirically conditioned existence, and that in it there is never any unconditioned necessity with reference to any quality, that there is no member in the series of conditions which one ought not to expect, as far as possible, to seek the empirical condition in a possible experience, and that we are never justified in deriving any existence from a condition outside the empirical series, or in considering it as absolutely independent and self-sufficient in the series itself, yet without denying in the least that the whole of the series may rest on some intelligible being, which is free, therefore, from all empirical conditions, and itself contains, rather, the ground of the possibility of all these appearances. By this, we do not by any means intend to prove the unconditionally necessary existence of such a being, or even just to demonstrate the possibility of a merely intelligible condition of the existence of appearances of the world of sense. The possibility of a merely intelligible condition of the existence of appearances in the world of sense. But just as on the one hand we limit reason, lest it should leave the thread of empirical conditions and go straying into transcendent grounds of explanations incapable of being represented in concreto, so, on the contrary, we want to limit the law of the merely empirical use of the understanding, lest it should venture to decide on the possibility of things in general, and declare the intelligible, despite the fact that it is of no use to us in the explanation of appearances, to be therefore impossible. What is shown by this is simply that the thoroughgoing contingency of all things in nature and of all their empirical conditions can well coexist with the adopted presupposition of a necessary, although merely intelligible, condition, and that there is no real contradiction between these two views. They can both be true. Okay. So I think that's what I was getting at before. So there is a necessary being in the universe, but there's also not a necessary being in the universe. Can both be true simultaneously. Okay. Granted that such an absolutely necessary being of the understanding is impossible in itself, we still maintain that this impossibility cannot be inferred from the universal contingency and dependence of all that belongs to the world of sense. Okay. So it may be empirically impossible, but that doesn't mean it's like universally impossible related to the kind of the worlds we don't have access to, e.g. things in themselves, that whole situation. Nor be inferred from the principle that we ought not to stop at any single member in so far as it is contingent, and appeal to a cause outside the world. Reason follows its own course in its empirical use, and a special course in its transcendental use. The world of sense contains nothing but appearances, and these are mere representations. The world of sense contains nothing but appearances, and these are mere representations, which are always in turn sensibly conditioned. Since our objects are never things in themselves, we need not be surprised that we are never justified in making a leap from a member of the empirical series beyond the context of the sensibility. Makes sense. To do so would be to act as if these members were things in themselves, existing apart from their transcendental ground, and which we could leave behind in order to seek for the cause of their existence outside them. This, no doubt, would have to be done in the end with contingent things, but not with mere representations of things, the contingency of which is itself merely a phenomenon, and cannot lead to any other regress, but which determines the phenomena, that is, that which is empirical. To conceive, however, an intelligible ground of appearances, that is, of the world of sense, and to conceive it as freed from the contingency of the latter, does not run counter. To conceive, however, an intelligible ground of appearances, that is, of the world of sense, and to conceive it as freed from the contingency of the latter, the world of sense, does not run counter either to the unlimited empirical regress in the series of appearances, or to their thoroughgoing contingency. So essentially, a completely disconnected world isn't antithetical to the empirical regress down to back forever, or through the fact that all appearances are contingent. There's no necessary thing. And this is really the only thing which we had to establish in order to remove this apparent antinomy, and it could be done in this way only. For if the condition of everything that is conditioned, with respect to its existence, is always sensible, and therefore belongs to the series, then the condition is itself again conditioned, as shown in the antithesis of the fourth antinomy. Either, therefore, there would remain a conflict with reason, which demands the unconditioned, or this unconditioned would have to be placed outside the series in the intelligible. The necessity of the intelligible neither requires nor admits of any empirical condition, and the intelligible is therefore, as regards appearances, unconditionally necessary. Either, therefore, there would remain a conflict with reason, which demands the unconditioned, or this unconditioned would have to be placed outside the series in the intelligible. So there could be an unconditioned being which caused the universe. Either it's going to be, there are two options. It can exist in the universe, but that would be in contradiction to the fact that there can't be anything unconditioned within a universe that contains conditioned things, as we talked about. But the other option is that the unconditioned would have to be placed outside the series and in the intelligible ground, so in the noumenon ground, I suppose. The necessity of the intelligible neither requires nor admits of any empirical condition. So it can be in any kind of form, and it doesn't have to be empirical. And the intelligible is therefore, as regards appearances, unconditionally necessary. In this situation, I guess that would be true. Yeah. If you were to put the unconditioned required being there, yes, I suppose. If that's what he's talking about. I agree, I think. The empirical use of reason, with regard to the conditions of existence in the world of sense, is not affected by the admission of a merely intelligible being. But ascends, according to the principle of a thoroughgoing contingency, from empirical conditions to higher ones, which again are empirical. But just as little does this regulative principle exclude, when we come to the pure use of reason with reference to ends, the admission of an intelligible cause not contained in the series. For in this case, an intelligible cause only means the transcendental, and, to us, unknown ground of the possibility of the sensible series in general. Okay. And the existence of this ground as independent of all conditions of the sensible series, and, with regard to it, as unconditionally necessary, is by no means opposed to the unlimited contingency of the conditions, nor to the never-ending regress right in the series of empirical conditions. All right, concluding remarks on the whole antinomy of pure reason. Oh man, this has been a journey. As long as it is only the totality of the conditions in the world of sense, and what can be done with regard to it in the interest of reason, that form our object in dealing with the concepts of reason, our ideas are no doubt transcendental, but yet cosmological. If, however, we place the unconditioned, which we are chiefly concerned, in that which is entirely outside the world of sense, and therefore outside all possible experience, our ideas become transcendent, yes. For they then serve not only for the completion of the empirical use of reason, which always remains an idea that must be pursued, though it can never be fully achieved. On the contrary, they separate themselves entirely from experience, and create for themselves objects the material of which is not taken from experience, and the objective reality of which also does not rest on the completion of the empirical series, but on pure a priori concepts. Okay. Such transcendent ideas have a merely intelligible object. Such transcendent ideas have a merely intelligible object, which may indeed be admitted as a transcendental object, of which we otherwise know nothing, but for which, if we wish to think it as a thing determinable by its inner and distinguishing predicates, we have neither any grounds of its possibility as independent of all concept of experience, nor the slightest justification in our side in assuming it as an object, and which, therefore, is a mere creation of our thoughts. Nevertheless, that cosmological idea which owes its origin to the fourth antinomy urges us to take that step. For the unconditioned existence of appearances, which within itself has no foundation, but is always conditioned, requires us to look out for something different from all appearances, that is, for an intelligible object in which there should be no more contingency. If, however, we have once allowed ourselves to admit, outside the field of the whole of sensibility, a self-subsistent reality, then appearances can be considered only as contingent modes on the part of beings which themselves are intelligences of representing intelligible objects. Okay? And consequently, nothing remains. So that would mean, so he's saying like, in that situation, like if objects were things in themselves, then we wouldn't be like the same. Like our we would have to be some sort of different like form of intelligence in order to experience them. And therefore, this tells us really nothing about our actual world, presumably. And consequently, nothing remains to us but analogy. In analogy, we employ the concepts of experience in order to form some kind of concept of intelligible things, of which we do not have the slightest knowledge as to what they are in themselves. Since we come to know the contingent only through experience, but have here to deal with things which are not meant to be objects of experience at all, we shall have to derive our knowledge of them from what is necessary in itself, that is, from pure concepts of things in general. Okay? Thus, the first step which we take outside the world of sense obliges us to begin our new knowledge with the investigation of the absolutely necessary being, and to derive from its concept the concepts of all things, insofar as they are merely intelligible. And this we shall attempt to do in the next chapter. Wait, so what will we do in the next chapter? The first step which we take outside the world of sense obliges us to begin our new knowledge with the investigation of the absolutely necessary being. So we're going to talk about God next chapter. And to derive from its concept the concept of all things, insofar as they are merely intelligible. And this we shall attempt to do in the next chapter. Wow. Okay. This took me several sittings that I'm going to splice together. Hope it sounds okay. But some of it was like really amazing and straightforward and just like absolutely incredible. And others of it I did get frustrated here at a few different occasions. But yeah, great stuff. Amazing. And hopefully we'll keep reading more soon.